My paper is about how people in post-Soviet Armenia created a memory space of Stalin-era repressions, being under various political constraints. The discussion on victims and executioners in this sense is an important marker for understanding how political history is worked out or reduced to a simplified black and white picture, which is usually convenient for the top-down history. I will try to show that grassroots commemorations, on the contrary, leave more room for an alternative readings for history and how other commemoration practices could influence on it. On post-Soviet Armenia, the problems of Soviet history began to be discussed rather late. This is usually explained by the fact that the space of public memory was occupied by discussions about Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire. In this sense, the memory of the genocide becomes part of the competitive memory. Historian Dan Diner pointed out that the precisely ethnicized memory could be passed down from the generation to generation and in fact works as cultural trauma. Jeffrey Alexander, exploring the cultural trauma, shifted the focus from the problem of experiencing trauma to its representation. And according to him, these memories have a precise potential for social mobilization and can radically change or at least influence the group identity. That's why, depending on the preferred theoretical frameworks, the researchers consider the Armenian genocide as the main factor of constructing the Armenian national identity, or as a master narrative or a root paradigm. Ron Yerevan distinguishes cultural trauma from collective one, considering the first as a nation-wide narrative, while the second trauma, collective, remains within the limited group. I will try to show how these two forms of memory interact with each other, not in a competitive mode, but rather as a multidirectional memory, which according to Michael Rothberg, is such a public representation of traumatic memory when cross-references produce more memory and not to reduce it. And less known historical events are not supplanted by the memory of the dominant cultural trauma, but on the contrary, receive ready tools for public representation. Before the memory of Armenian genocide became a master narrative, it went through a latent period of resistance to oblivion in the Soviet time. For that period, it could be qualified as a collective memory, which was very important mostly for the genocide survivors and their descendants. That's why, in addition to the mass demonstrations in 1965 in Yerevan, which is well known, there were different attempts towards the genocide at the level of individual initiatives, which are less known. For example, on the gravestones of genocide survivors who died after moving to Soviet Armenia, not only the years of birth and death of the deceased were indicated, but also the place of birth, the place name of settlements in Turkey from where the deceased was forced to immigrate. Thus, the tombstone was supposed to act as an evidence of the displacement of residents from Western Armenia. I recorded a similar practice among the Armenian deported to Siberia in 1949, who after their rehabilitation and return to Armenia, transported the ashes of their relatives who died in Siberia to their homeland. On the gravestones of these people, next to the inscription of the death year, the place of death in Siberia was indicated, and it was indicated the first burial and the year of reburial. These are cases of individual protest to the policy of ignoring to the fact of being the victims of Young Turk and Stalinist regimes. Despite similarities, these two practices of reflecting the migration history on personal tombstones were created independently from each other, but both were part of collective traumas, not cultural, when people try to occupy some public spaces to speak out about their personal or group tragedy. The Stalin purges in Armenia were accompanied by mass deportations, which according to the latest data affected at least 19,000 Armenians. However, even today, they do not become the subject of public discourse in Armenia. First of all, because of not being qualified as a national deportation, I guess, but targeting different social groups, Dashnaks, collaborators, former Turkish or Greek citizens, etc. So it's never turned down into a national narrative and stayed as a group trauma. It can be seen well when comparing two communications or two commemorations, the Armenian Genocide and the Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Repression. Both are included in the official calendar of post-Soviet Armenia. The Day of Repressions on June 14 has been commemorated in Armenia since 2006, when this day was chosen because the deportation campaign called Valna, the wave in Russian, happened on June 14 in 1949, when about 13,000 people were exiled from Armenia and 6,000 deportees were from Georgia, Azerbaijan, and the northern Black Sea region. The official opening the memorials took place in December 2008. The monument was opened by President Serge Sargsyan, and it was the same year when the post-election protests had been suppressed on March 1st, and 10 people were killed during these clashes. Possibly the participation of the president of Armenia and many other officials was a PR action to show their following to democratic values despite the fact of killed protesters. Representatives of the authorities, including the president, were present only at the opening of the monument. After this, none of these authorities, till today, has taken part in these commemorations. Whereas not only over 500,000 people go to the genocide monument on average every year on April 24th, but even under pandemic conditions in 2020, about 340,000 people registered on the online platform. There was also an opportunity to be registered virtually at the monument. This turned the monument not only into a memorial to the victims, but also into a memorial to those who remember. This is the case when the institutionalized and individual memories, even post-memories, are crossing at one point, especially because of referring to the cultural trauma. Following the genocide commemoration pattern, the commemoration of the Soviet-era repressions, instead of having an everyday working museum, is focused on the one-day memorial concept. The memorial of repressed people is open only June 14th, and the other days, the huge memorial is locked and very few people have any information where it is located, and even that there is such kind of memorial in the center of Yerevan on Cascade. However, in 2021 and 2022, due to the memorial organization activists from Russia, a new wave of the revitalization of names of Stalin-era repression victims, returning the names, is taking place in Armenia. This event tending to become a new tradition and to be integrated into the international commemoration of the Stalin-era victims. It is worth mentioning that the memorial band in Russia was awarded the Nobel Prize in Peace in 2022. And by the way, today Memorial is broadcasting the records of the actions of returning the name. It is right today. And the Yerevan event recorded a week ago is also included in this all-day lasted virtual commemoration. Until 2008, various tragedies were compared to genocide, presenting the Armenians as victims and enemies usually called Turks. However, after the above-mentioned killing the protesters in Yerevan in 2008, the ethnic demarcation between victims and executioners began to blur. That year, during a morning demonstration at the memorial complex, along with the usual genocide posters, the opposition carried a poster with the inscription 1.5 million plus 10. It was a paraphrase of a poster about the murder of Turkish journalist of Armenian origin, Hrant Dink, 1.5 million plus 1. The placement of victims and executioners within common ethnic boundaries was also made in 2014 regarding an attempt to erect a monument to Anastas Mikoyan in one of the central parks of Yerevan. Mikoyan, as one of the rare long livers of the Soviet nomenclatura, turned out to be a very convenient occasion to launch public discussions on the Soviet past, since he participated in many important historical events. Petr Shakaran told us in detail about Mikoyan's positive role in the rehabilitation of the Soviet regime victims. Although, for honesty, it must be admitted that the change in relation to the memory of Charand, the return of his memory, did not mean the rehabilitation of other victims or an appropriate way of rehabilitation of their rights, including even Charand's wife, who was arrested according to Article 69 for non-denunciation. This is the official title of the Article 69. Ninth, and never rehabilitated. At least we couldn't find the appropriate document in her case in National Archive in Armenia recently. In dialogue with the authorities, representatives of the movement against the setting up of the monument appealed to the facts of Anastas Mikoyan's biography, which could be interpreted as crimes of varying degrees, from national, more often stories related to genocide, to indifference to repressed friends and relatives, but main accusations were based on the document widely circulated in social media, where Mikoyan asks for additional 700 executions for Armenians, while documents on shooting much more victims of non-Armenian origin, for example, 22,000 Polish officers in Katyk case or 5,000 prisoners in Irkutsk, were less accentuated. The political context, the association of Armenia with the Russian-led custom union instead of the European Union, unexpectedly proclaimed by President Serge Sargsyan on September 3rd, 2013, created a suitable space for hot discussions on relations, historical or current, with Russia. So the proposal to erect Mikoyan's monument became a part of the discourse on the recolonization of Armenia by Russia, at least at that period. Coming to the grassroots initiatives to stand up monuments dedicated to the Stalin regime victims, it must be said that the tradition of civil initiatives to erect monuments through the efforts of the community is widespread practices in Armenia. It gained its greatest scope during the Second World War, and the memorials that appeared in almost every village to those who perished in the Second World War did not mean formal monuments to the unknown soldier, but were dedicated to specific victims from this settlement, whose names were indicated on the memorial. More than 600 such monuments have been recorded in Armenia. Still here. And the process of their installation continues to this day because the relatives of the victims perceive these monuments as a symbolic grave of relatives who did not return from the war. It is not surprising that some monuments turned out to be close to religious structures, churches, chapels, or places of pilgrimage, especially those that were erected in the post-Soviet period. That is, these places of memory can be considered not so much as memorials, reminders of the past, but following Paul Konatat as loci of memory, topography with a certain form of behavior, rituals inscribed in everyday life. Unlike monument cenotaph to those killed in the Second World War, the state or local administration sponsored and encouraged their installation. Monuments to the repressed are usually erected at the expense of the families of the victims. They are, of course, still significantly smaller in number. I recorded about 15 such monuments. Some of them are marked on this map. And what they have in common with monuments of the Second World War is that they also bear concrete names. The initiators of erecting the monuments to the repressed are usually their descendants, as I mentioned. Even the official memorial complex in Yerevan dedicated to the victims of Stalin purges was designed by the architect Jim Torosyan, who himself was the son of a repressed person. In rare cases, such an initiative comes from representatives of the local administration, as was the case, for example, in the village of Arachadzor in the south of Armenia, in Syunik region. The decision of the chairman of the community erected a monument in 2011 with the names of fellow villagers who were executed by shooting appeared under the influence of reading the book On This Side of the Iron Curtain, published by local historian Grisha Sambatan, who mentioned in his book all of the local villagers who was arrested. The most notable part of the monument is the free space. Is the free space left after the name of the repressed to be able to write in the names of the victims who may be found in the future. These free spaces define the new concepts of the monument and as an unfinished text, as an invitation to conversation, and where stand of a period there is analysis. Another important point for local initiatives is to establish a monument to the repressed is the choice of the site. In rare cases, the location is determined by the topography of the historical event, and the difficulty is that the place of executions were not recorded anywhere, and it is impossible to restore them even from archival documents. There is some oral information about places of mass executions, like a place near Gyumri, known as a Gorge of Massacres, because the population of the nearest villages was massacred during the Armenian Genocide. However, interlocutors from these villages argued that the victims of the Great Terror in 1966 and 67 were buried there too, just 10 or 15 years later after the Turkish massacre. But monument was dedicated only to genocide victims, and few people know about the relations between the place and the repression victims. For the initiators of the monuments of repressed in the village of Gol, an important message was the lessons of history that needed to be learned by descendants. Therefore, they chose a site near the school for the monument, and it was important for the initiators that the monument had no religious connotation. So they did not make it in the form of a cross stone, but wanted to emphasize that the monuments has a civil message, both for memory and oblivion. Forgetfulness here acts as a punishment. And in the center of the monument, the victims' names are indicated, and in the upper part, its dedication is carved in memory of the Gokchans repressed in 1937 and 38. As the authors of the monument explained, they deliberately chose such an inscription so that Stalin's name was not mentioned in it, because he was unworthy to be immortalized in such a way. In the same time, on the monument, there was the name of the person who reported on the other victims whose names had been marked on the same stone. And as the initiators explained, the purpose of the monument is to raise the issue of guilt and point out the regime that forced people to denounce each other. And those who fell, both victims and executioners, were perceived as the victims of the regime, of which they saw Stalin as the main architect. Therefore, unlike their local executioners, they deprived him of their right to stay in the memory. In Gyumri, the choice of the place for the repression victims memorial in the church square, because the monument is dedicated to the executed priest of this diocese. And the cross that fell from the dome of the church in one of the neighboring village, Haykadzor, had been set up as a monument. The cross was badly damaged. According to the stories, at different times, the Bolsheviks fight at one side and Turkish soldiers on the other. The church is located on the border between Armenia and Turkey. Was on the center of the city, this monument at the same time became an object of worship as a religious artifact, which believers treat as if it were a cross in a church. For tourists, the bullet holes left on the spherical base on the cross became a place for a tourist ritual throwing coins. Here, the memorial acts as a memory locus, a space with certain urban practices of relationship with a monument which does not become a detached memory site. In conclusion, let me highlight some of the features of the memory work on the cases of memory victims and executioners of Stalin era repression very briefly. In the presence of cultural trauma in Armenian case, it's a trauma of genocide. The practices of its memorialization sometimes serve as a model for other cases of collective trauma, like the Stalin era repression. And the cases of the collective trauma, the authorities are inclined to adhere not so much to memory politics as to oblivion politics, where the local initiatives made possible counter-memory. Thank you.